think she'll. I'll just, yeah, I'll wait for. Let's wait for these last people to sit down. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. I see people are still streaming in. Wow, it's wonderful to see such a great turnout for this session on innovations in financing independent journalism. My name is Heather Gilberts. I'll be moderating the session. I'm Deputy Director of the Center for International Media Assistance, which is a think tank based at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by three tremendous speakers. At the end is Harlan Mandel. He is the CEO of the Media Development Investment Fund, which supports independent news companies by providing debt and equity financing in countries where a free press is under threat. Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro is CEO and co-founder of the National Trust for Local News, a U.S. nonprofit dedicated to keeping local news in local hands by acquiring and transforming community news organizations. And Jakub Perezinski is director at The Fix, a media industry publication and research hub. Jakub co-founded the Kyiv Independent in Ukraine and is helping grow its internal research and think tank center, Key Insights. So by way of introduction, just a brief introduction to this session, I obviously don't need to tell a room full of journalists and media experts that the media industry is in financial crisis in countries around the world. And we're going to spend the next several days talking about the unprecedented challenges the sector is facing. But for the next 50 minutes, I'm really excited because we're not going to focus very much on the problems. We're going to talk about some potential solutions. But before we get to the solution, I'd like to set the stage by discussing one massive problem, which is that in the current environment, there simply isn't enough money in the system to support all of the news outlets that are struggling to stay alive. The economic precarity of the news industry is leading to unprecedented levels of media capture, news deserts, economic censorship. And this problem is particularly acute in lower income countries, and those countries where press freedom is under attack. To put this into context, the world's highest income countries commit less than $500 million per year to support media, just 0.3% of official development assistance. And only a small fraction of that amount, less than 10%, so around $50 million, reaches news organizations on the ground in countries that receive aid, so very small amounts of money. And if we're being realistic, it doesn't look like the amount of money in the aid system is going to increase drastically anytime soon. So we need to catalyze other forms of finance, and we need to move beyond an over-reliance on traditional grant-making. And really, there is only one way to increase funding at the scale necessary to save journalism, by incentivizing private capital, and yes, even commercial capital in some cases, to join us in funding independent media. I realize this is not without controversy. The news industry requires a particular kind of capital that does not compromise its independence and that can withstand the economic volatility of the sector where profit margins are thin, if not non-existent. But in other public goods sectors like clean water, affordable housing, innovations in funding have successfully unleashed new capital. Impact investors and ethically minded businesses have come to the table to close the financing gap using finance vehicles that are mission focused. Instead of investing with the sole purpose of increasing the bottom line, cashing out on commercial returns, they're taking a middle ground, earning a small return, or in some cases no return, while cashing out on impact. But how do these approaches apply to the media sector? We're going to talk today about some of these models, how they work, and how they can move the needle on financial sustainability for news. So I've talked briefly about why new capital forms are needed, but our speakers are all really first movers and innovators in this space, and they're here to talk about how. So Harlan, I'm going to begin with you. What are the different financial vehicles or approaches that MDIF uses to support media, and what is the rationale behind them?
This works? Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Buongiorno. So we're, I would say, unfortunately, the only fund dedicated to providing investment capital for independent media in the majority world. So that means we want to be able to provide capital across the business life cycle of a media company. So from early stage to growth to mature. And each one of those needs requires a different kind of capital, with a different risk profile. So that means equity, it means quasi-equity, it means loans, it means seed capital, venture capital style financing, all of that. So we try to do that. So we have set up and raised different kinds of funds to meet each of those capital needs. Each of these funds needs to be aligned because we have to raise the money, and then we need to provide the capital. So we need to align the way we raise the money with the way we are providing capital to media companies. So we have different fund structures that do that. So we have an equity fund, what we call our Emerging Media Opportunity Fund, which does growth equity. We have a fund called Pluralis, which is specifically designed to fight media capture in Europe by taking significant ownership positions in companies that are at risk. We have what we call MDIF Ventures, which provides venture capital style financing for early stage companies. And then we have what we call our Amplify programs, which are innovation programs that provide grants as seed capital for experimenting with new revenue models and combines that with a lot of coaching, capacity building, and peer-to-peer knowledge transfer. So that, with those different vehicles, we're able to cover the life cycle of most media companies and most of their needs. That's our goal, and it's the challenge is, of course, the number of media companies out there are far beyond the scope of the financing that we have. So we can't meet the needs for everybody, but we do our best.
Harlan, I'm just going to follow up with one additional question. Your comment about aligning the way you raise capital with the way you deploy capital. What is the argument when you approach investors, financiers of different types? What is the argument you make about why these innovative forms of finance are better or useful for the media sector where you invest?
Well, I think the first thing is making the case for providing finance for independent media. If you look at foreign assistance flows of money, independent media is one of the tiniest, it's almost like a speck on the graph of funds that are out there for development purposes. So actually making the case for providing capital for independent media companies is the first part of that, and in many ways I would say the hardest part. Because it's competing with all kinds of other things, so the environment, health, refugee conditions. The list is very long, and unfortunately, the folks with the resources see independent media as not the biggest priority. So that's the first thing, making the case. Then we need to be able to align the fund structures with with the interests of the investors, because we are seeking for loan funds, we're taking loans. For equity funds, we're taking in either limited partnership interests or we're issuing common equity in a fund. And the investors have their own return expectations, and it varies. So, for philanthropists, they're possibly willing to actually make a grant into that fund. For commercial bank clients, they're possibly willing to make a loan into a fund. And then there's a whole range of folks in between, what we would call impact investors, primarily development finance institutions, and they all have their own different requirements for returns and for not only returns, but for the duration. When are they going to get their money back? What's the risk profile that they're willing to take? So the reality is, with independent media companies, the risks are much higher than what you would normally find in a commercial transaction that offers a similar level of return. So what we have to do is try to, for more commercial-oriented investors, we need to mitigate the risks. So we do that, for example, by, for example, Pluralis, the fund I mentioned, we have about 10% of the capital is provided by a number of foundations in the form of grants into the capital structure. They're putting money in, they don't expect any money back. And that helps reduce the risk for the commercial investors. And this kind of first loss provision is we find very powerful in attracting investors because it really mitigates the risk. So for our loan fund, for example, we have a guarantee from the Swedish government, which agrees to take the first 50% of the risk for the lenders.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, I'm going to turn next to you. The National Trust for Local News, focused on community local journalism in the U.S., has a unique model that aims, through its financing approach, to help struggling community news organizations stay afloat. How does your approach use innovative financing to improve the sustainability of local news?
Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Can everybody hear me? Yep. I'll pull this forward. Okay, great. Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about our model, and then I'll get to the financing question because they're related. So we own and operate community newspapers. We have 64 community newspapers across 3 states in the U.S., Colorado, Maine, and Georgia. We employ 250 journalists. We have about 500 employees nationally. And we are looking at a really critical and kind of overlooked segment of the newspaper market in the U.S. So the communities that we serve, the newspapers that we acquire and operate, they serve communities of 250,000 people and fewer. So it's not really kind of like Rome or Milan size, it's really kind of Perugia sized in terms of communities. And this is important because in a lot of these communities, these papers have been family owned for really generations, and they're providing a service and a product that people can't get anywhere else. So that hyper-local focus is really important for the business model that we're creating. So still in the US, there's about 4,000 of these papers left. They're often, as I said, owned by families, folks in their 60s and 70s who don't really have future options for their business. The kids don't want the business. They don't really want to sell to a big chain or to a hedge fund. So, that's the layer that we're focused on. So we're assembling basically a consolidated business model. So we're acquiring these papers. We have them in state trusts. But what we're able to do is realize efficiencies and economies of scale across the network that mean that we can run these as sustainable businesses. So, for example, we are projecting a 7% revenue growth across our portfolio papers this year. So that means that we can use creative forms of financing for acquisition and for investment that would be more difficult to access for a very small business. So, our goal is ultimately to use impact capital to scale and then continue to run these on earned revenue. And I can talk a little bit about some of the challenges of doing that, but it's really the operating model that's allowing us to use creative financing. So far, we've used concessionary vehicles, so short-term concessionary, so a year, 2 years, anywhere 500,000 to sort of 2 million for specific investment needs, for specific acquisition needs. But as you mentioned at the start, the scale of capital that's needed to solve the problem of independent media everywhere really is going to require, as Harlan is saying, bringing folks to the table who have different return profiles, different risk profiles, and who can provide capital at a scale much bigger than kind of project-based financing of 1 million or 2 million at a time.
Great, and just one follow-up question. How is this approach sort of transformational for the sustainability of community news? How do you move them from being flailing news organizations, barely able to stay afloat, to now becoming sort of robust, sustainable community
Yeah,
news.
so we have 4 common strategies that we employ across the set. So one is modernizing operations. So for a lot of these small businesses, they're small family businesses. Some of them have not had modernized accounting or professional management. So there's a whole layer of kind of like cost and efficiency that we can drive just kind of at the operational level. Many of them have also not had access to the investment funds to be able to do things like have a new CMS or invest in a new product strategy or add an editor or a reporter to a growing community. So there's also a lot that we can do just on the investing product side. And then similarly on being able to harness technology and data. Some of the newspapers that we've acquired never had websites, never had any audience information at all. So we're really taking them kind of from 0 to 1, I would say. And being able to do that in a market where people really love and value their papers just means that we're able to, invest in ways that will grow the audience just kind of right off the bat.
Great, thank you. Jakub, I'm going to turn to you next. I know you've been thinking a lot about these issues. You've been writing about them. And as we've discussed several times in the work we've done together, applying private sector models to funding journalism is not without critique. Some say that using debt, loans, for instance, or equity forms of funding simply don't work, that the news industry is not going to generate the kinds of returns that investors want, that this is a failed project. How do you respond to that from your experience in Central and Eastern Europe?
So a couple of years ago, let's say 5 years ago, if you would talk about commercial models and investment in independent media, especially in developing or emerging markets like in CE, people would look at you sort of with a quizzical kind of like, who's this sort of quirky character? I think we've gone past that phase, but it still seems very niche. And actually when sort of thinking about today's discussion, I looked through sort of all of the cases, and it's actually not niche at all. There's a lot of private sector investment into the media sector, including in the CE. The thing is, it isn't always called investment for various reasons, part of it being sort of the, let's say, spiciness of media pressure in Central and Eastern Europe, which isn't always outright, but also sort of looks at opportunities to pressure investors and things like that. People keep it quiet for commercial reasons. So there isn't always an article that says X invested. But if you look at the number of cases that you can objectively call an investment, there's a lot of them. In Ukraine, we've got, there was the purchase of Ukraińska Prawda and NW, which I would describe as an investment into the media sector. Denik N, both with one N and two Ns, are fantastic examples. And at least for the one with one N, I know that there was an involvement of sort of Czech investors as well, non-media folks who came in and took part of that. There's the big investments more recently in Gremi Media and Petit Press from Pluralis. And there's also, and I think this is one of the things that we tend to really, really overlook, there's actually been a fair amount of investment into what we could dub media tech, right? So the sort of solutions that enable media to do what they do. Just to name a couple of examples, in Ukraine, Genesis, which is a big media company that you may have never heard of because they don't necessarily advertise that much, invested 150K into a Ukrainian podcast platform. Wirtualna Polska invested $3 million about into Patronite, which is Polish Patreon. Don't know how they're sort of navigating that trademark issue there, but it's a very successful media. And for those who know Piano, which at this point is quite a heavyweight, I remind you that Piano started as a startup from Slovakia, right? And a couple of years ago, I was talking to folks at The Economist who are wondering, like, why are all of our sort of subscription managers like in Slovakia? Like, where is this coming from? And media tech investments are more important than they seem. So if you think about sort of the logic about it, these are companies that need media to be successful in order to That's their bread and butter. That's how they make money. So they're interested in ways that other people are not in making media successful. And they have enabled amazing media. So when the Polish government, the previous government, I need to say, went after Trójka, which was a popular Polish radio, journalists from that radio went out and founded not one but two independent radio stations, Radio Nowy Świat and Radio 357. Both of these got funding through Patronite to the tune of, for Nowy Świat, I think about $150,000 a month, right? That wouldn't necessarily have been possible, or at least as easy, without the media tech. So to answer your question, how is the scene doing? I think it is growing. I think it is successful. But I think we're still a long way away from operating at scale.
Yeah, just a follow-up question for you as well. If you're talking to Piano or Deniken, and they said, would you say, well, would you just like to have a grant? Like, what is the rationale for them as media company owners to take on innovative finance, take on debt and equity? What does it do for them as media outlets versus the grant that they don't have to give anything back to anyone?
Well, this is a bit of a problematic one, and the answer is there isn't a good rationale, right? And I talk to media managers like all day, and every time I mention investment, 2/3 of them will answer, "Wait, but I can give away equity and get some money once, or I can get the same money and just have one of my sort of assistants write up a really long grant proposal and get the same thing without giving away anything." So there is definitely a tension here. And when we look at the history of media investment, it's usually done by people who had no experience of grant fundraising and aren't aware of the scale of money that is available, right? Available in general, by the way, not to each media, but if you go after it, it's there, it's relatively easy, and this is frankly a problem. It is a hurdle that innovative finance needs to overcome. I would counter this. In my experience, sort of partners who are investors, especially ones that have a network or a understanding of product or an understanding of audiences or organizations that frankly most donors don't have because it's completely different realities, they can be much better partners to scale your company than any development fund, than almost any development fund, let's say. So there is a lot of untapped potential, but we do need greater visibility. People who get investment are busy making their investors happy. They're not necessarily like spending too much time telling people about their case. So it's still, we need more information so that people understand the benefits of the other side.
Harlan or Elizabeth, I'm wondering if you also have a response to this question of the rationale. From my perspective, grant making is not renewable. It's minus 100% return. I mean, that's what it is. So I'm curious from your perspectives working with media companies, what is the rationale for them to take on a different form of finance that's not a negative 100% return?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're finding is that at a smaller scale of business, there really is no good rationale, because I think local media businesses at a medium-sized level of scale, like you just can't get the kinds of efficiencies and returns. Like I think we are in a moment where consolidation like has to happen in order to attract that kind of investment capital. In fact, I was meeting with an owner last week who said, I can't continue at this scale. I either have to get really big or I have to get really small. And I think that's the case for a lot of media owners, around the globe. So I would say, yes, we need to attract that capital, and I think it's there, and there's going to be a stronger rationale when some of these business fundamentals change.
Yeah, and Harlan.
It's on? Okay. So, first of all, when a media operator comes to me and says, should I take a grant? I say yes, okay? It's free money, you can't beat it, okay? The problem is there's not a lot of it, first of all. It's incredibly scarce, and it's incredibly, I don't mean it pejoratively, but it's fickle in the sense that funders' priorities change for a whole host of reasons. And the money moves around the world, and you can just see it moving. So it may be available one day and it's not available the other. So that's the first thing. I also think it's important to say that for probably the vast majority of worthwhile media projects that are out there, grants are the only possible source of financing. So if you're a nonprofit, you can't take equity investment, and it's also very hard to for anybody to make a loan to a nonprofit because if you're depending on grants, the certainty of revenue for repaying a loan is too uncertain. But I think that for media companies that are able to attract investment, one, it can be at a much larger scale than is what's available from grants. I can tell you for sure that there are nobody making grants at the scale of some of the investments that we make. Second of all, I think to echo Jakob, investors bring a lot more than just funding. At least that's our goal. We try to be a strategic investor, and I think most investors in the space are in that category, frankly, because it's hard to find individuals who to make investments in these kinds of companies, I think. And that means they bring a lot of resources, they bring network effects, they bring potential efficiencies. Elizabeth, in a way, I think more than money, that's the main value proposition that you bring, right? The expertise and the economies of scale. So, I think they're just very, very different things, grants versus investments.
Really interesting point about grant making not giving a media organization as much control over their finances because, again, they're at the whimsy of kind of the grant making priorities. I'd like to turn to dive a little bit deeper into this question of supply, because in the work we've been doing for the past several years at SEMA, we've spoken with many impact investors about, would you be interested in starting to do impact investing in the media sector? Big funds, that do impact investing in other sectors. And the first thing they always say is, but where's the pipeline? There's an issue of supply. So I'd like the three of you to sort of address this issue. What do we do when there's a lack of supply? How do we move the needle on this approach and encourage more impact investors to come on board when this question of pipeline is always out there? Jakob, I don't know if you want to start.
Sure. So maybe just to add a little bit of nuance here, I think there's both a supply issue on the side of targets that you can acquire, but also on the diversity of funds that are available. So maybe to start on that end, one thing that sort of comes across is if you look at some of the biggest and most successful investment stories in the media space, very often you see that like media industry investors, so the type of people who would be at this conference, are not the main part or not the only part of their investment story, right? So, take, Gimlet, who sold for over 200 million to Spotify. A lot of their early investors were not media specific. There were media investors along the way, yes, but they weren't the only ones. And then finally, the exit option, Spotify, also, it's a tech company, right? It's sort of closer to media than maybe Meta is, or I don't know, you can debate that, but it's still, there was a sort of exit story there, right? Piano, who I mentioned earlier, a couple of years ago closed an 88 million investment round with LinkedIn being one of their buyers, right? And I think one of the challenges that I've seen from the other end of the spectrum is that if you've got a great idea, if you've got a really cool sort of media project that you want to very aggressively develop, there aren't necessarily a lot of partners there who have the right risk tolerance, who are ready to, media is super risky, by the way. If you know, I'm sure most of you know that already. If you don't, welcome. Like, it's super volatile, and one of the challenges, I think, that it's volatile in terms of content, distribution, technology, everything. And it's really hard to kill a project that just isn't taking off because you pour your heart into the content, right? So then, it's really sad when you see that it's going nowhere. You try to push it as far as possible. But if you're an entrepreneur who wants to kick off a project, it's difficult, one that's risky, innovative, and so forth. It's difficult to find the kind of private investor in the media space that has the willingness to go in, and that has the willingness to go in at the right valuation, right? And I think that's sort of where I would start the story. There's a ton of entrepreneurs out there. They have bootstrapped companies, they have grown companies. They don't always show up on the the donor radar, because they manage to circumnavigate it. But they would be more than happy to take seed investments, stage A and so forth, investments to grow. We just need sort of the right kind of funding infrastructure for them.
Go ahead, Elizabeth. Same.
Yeah, so I think this is a really critical question, and it really depends on what type of media you're targeting. So, for us, we are looking very specifically at legacy assets that have a history of profitability and current profitability, and we're looking for ways to create that supply. So, like right in front of us right now, we have about $25 million worth of investable deals that have anywhere from a 5 to a 10% margin, but that's after really understanding what we're looking for. So I think we also have to have this conversation about specific media types, because different media types, to I think both of your points, really do need different types of capital. So I think that's the kind of first step. And then to recognize that, we are missing in many places, and this is why what you do is so amazing, we are missing that intermediary layer between the impact investors, philanthropic community, who can kind of assemble those different sets of interests on the one hand, with like the kind of matchmaking of deal flow, business models on the other. And so without a really strong intermediary layer, I think the media business is like too fractured to be able to say to any given media owner, you should really go chase investment capital.
Again, I think this is a really important issue, and I echo everything that's been said already. I think, if you kind of get down to the nitty-gritty of it, where we work, in the majority world, there are a lot of development institutions of various flavors that are specifically set up to finance small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs as they're called. Media companies, I'm not really aware of any that have received loans or other financing from those kinds of institutions. And part of that is because, quite frankly, the media business, it's a really weird business, okay? So even in the US, when before things went really south, even then, it was very hard for a media company to get a bank loan, because banks just weren't equipped to understand how this weird business with, weird seasonality and from the outside what looks like very unpredictable revenues, how do you make a loan against that? So some banks had set up special media lending facilities that had that expertise. But if you're generally out there making loans to farms or restaurants or sausage manufacturers, the media business is really complicated. And if you're looking at a small bit, and why is that? Because especially now, there are so many different revenue lines that any media company needs to be in. You know, subscription, you know, reader revenue, advertising, events, and you know, the list goes on and on. So I think that's one piece. It's just, you know, without a certain amount of expertise, it's hard. And second of all, from the media company's perspective, if you're going to have an investor, you want to make sure that they're aligned with you in terms of your principles, right? So if you're just talking to a generic bank or, you know, a generic development funder, you know, at the end of the day, they're not going to be there when you need them when you come under pressure. You know, they're not going to be able to be patient the way a media company needs an investor to be patient, certainly in the majority world. So I think that's one piece. But then I think we also have to face the fact that you know, the whole media industry has been going through massive disruption for, you know, 2 decades now, right? So a lot of companies have come and gone in the meantime. And you know, the way we've been trying to address that is with what I mentioned earlier, our Amplify programs, which are there to, you know, help companies experiment with new revenue models to see what can work. And you know, once they find something that works, then they become investable. So you know, we really believe seeding the future of independent media is really critical.
Yeah, and of course, those kinds of incubators and accelerators are quite common in other enterprise sectors, but much less common in the media sector. We have about 15 minutes left. I have more questions, but I think I'll pause and turn to the audience and see if we've got any questions for our panelists. Okay, I'll take a couple of questions at once. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions and perhaps just one comment. So the question, first question for the speaker from MDIF, what is holding back the possibility of establishing similar entities to yours that are regionally focused? So having a Middle East MDIF, an African MDIF. I'm from Egypt, for example, and I can tell you there's no money coming to Egypt. And maybe it's happening in grants money, okay? There's almost zero. So this is one question. There are businessmen who are interested in the media space, but and I'm willing to help, by the way, but it's difficult for me to access them on my own, plus I have to run a company. But with support of other media support organizations, we can start creating that funding networks, regional funding networks. The second question really, or perhaps actually you did answer it a little bit, is like, what is stopping us from having media-focused accelerators? This is what creates the pipeline in other sectors. There isn't that many, and also the ones that exist, I'm sorry to say this, but they give silly amount of money, like $5,000 or $10,000. I mean, the amount of time I spend to fill an application and go through the process is not worth this money compared to other accelerators in other tech sectors that give 100K and stuff. So we need to reconsider this. The last comment, I think one of the biggest problems with unlocking private venture capital is the ecosystem itself. The ecosystem has a very negative perception, the media ecosystem, of businesses. Mm-hmm. I run an online platform that's for profit, and immediately I feel like I have to be apologetic about it. When I come to journalism conferences, like, I'm sorry, we're for profit, but guess what? In Egypt, you can't even start a non-profit that's for media. So I think it also comes from the fact of a little bit, if I can use this word, of ignorance about other ecosystems and the reality of other regions. Thank you.
We'll take 2 questions, the gentleman here, and then do another round.
Thank you. I'm Emin Hussein from Azerbaijan, but I'm exile-based journalist. My question is, do you have any models for authoritarian state? Because my colleague partly asked, like, I absolutely agree with the situation with Egypt. It's impossible to implement same models, which is you are talking, even colleague which is sharing his example with Eastern Europe practices. But in our countries, like 5 billion population of the world live in the 60 authoritarian states. And which kind of offer do you have for them or advices? Because for us, it's difficult in our countries, like especially oil-rich countries. We always thinking last 30 years since Azerbaijan independence, how to unlock private companies funding for local civil society and independent medias. For example, British Petroleums or international banks which is working with our authoritarian rulers. How it's possible to change the situation, to change the mind of these international investors like transnational oil and gas companies or bank companies? Is it possible or it's mission impossible? What do you think?
Yeah, so two really good questions about kind of building regional networks. How do we incentivize the private sector business leaders who have a lot of money, may even be interested? How do we get them to come together and create funding structures?
So I should take the first question, which is, why are there no other funds? And there have been a number of efforts to create regional media investment funds over the years. They have failed for a variety of reasons. Okay, I can say we've tried to seed a few, and those have worked. The models that we found worked were working with local publisher associations, for example, and providing a pool of funds that they could then lend to their members, and that has worked in Indonesia. A long time ago, we were able to do it in Russia. And I think that's a model that we continue to be interested in trying to support. We've tried to support some of these other regional funds that have come on board, but they have not worked out for very specific reasons, I would say, relating to either the folks who were backing them having problems or the people who were running them having problems. In terms of accelerators, I agree. You need to have enough funding if you're going to give somebody money to make it worth the effort and to actually achieve, enough money to give something a chance to succeed. I think the challenge is that most accelerators out there do ultimately have a profit motive, and I think that the VC world has largely figured out that you're not going to get the kind of hockey stick return that venture capitalists want from a digital media company. It's digital, but it's not Amazon.
Gaming. Jakub?
Can I
go
just
ahead.
add? I think this point about the whole sector having a really bad reputation is a really important one, and it frankly drives me a little crazy that then all the rest of us go around like telling that same story. I think there are business successes, there are successes everywhere, and so I think some of this is also like, how can we tell a different story, not just about the importance of the sector, but about the possibilities for a commercial future. And there is a big wide range between perpetually philanthropically supported nonprofits and hockey stick Amazon type returns. And for some reason, we've just decided that this is like the narrative ground on which we're going to talk about the future of the media business. So I really think, it's incumbent on us to start to tell different stories and introduce different ways of thinking about this, because that will be what brings in other folks. Nobody wants to invest in a dying industry.
Yeah, it's a great point. When we discuss the media sector, the spectrum of capital is consolidated on the two extremes, the minus 100% return or the plus 20 or 30% commercial return. But what we need to talk more about is the middle. Jakub, we've talked a lot about this.
Yeah, so I maybe just wanted to add a little comment. I agree with what was said previously, but just to kind of manage expectations a little bit, right? Because this is not the silver bullet. Like, investment is not the silver bullet that is going to save media. But also, investment is or sort of entrepreneurship even, is a much more difficult story than most people imagine, not just in media, right? So it is very literally a path that is littered with the quote-unquote dead bodies of entrepreneurs who failed along the way, and many of whom picked themselves back up and tried a second, a third time, and then succeeded only after that, right? So recently I don't want to sort of go too much because I think it's still sort of sensitive, but I was talking to a person who was putting together a large fund for Ukraine a while ago, and she said over the year she had 300 meetings, 280 people said no. Like in the first sort of, like, no way in hell, right? Recently closed one of the biggest deals in the country's history, right? And so, like, in order to be successful as an entrepreneur, in order to be successful in investment, you have to be a little bit crazy because the odds are against you. Yes, there are lots of examples of successes, but there are way, way more examples of failure. And right now, what I see in the media industry is that there aren't a lot of people who understand what that journey looks like. So it's very hard for them to even start. And then, you know, you need to be ready to take risk, to fail. And we're still an industry that stigmatizes failure a lot, which, by the way, I mean, we need to sort of leave that, right? So yeah, I think there's there's an expectations issue as well. So.
Great. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm Jan Wifstrand from Sweden. I think I primarily ask Elizabeth about this, but feel free to comment. I mean that the reason for many investors not to choose media is that, for example, among these 4,000 newspapers you're talking about, there is such a low level of innovation. It's so conservative. Most of them stick to business models that are from the Stone Age, not for the 2020s. So therefore they shy away and they don't care about them. Do you agree with my picture?
Just before you answer, I'm just going to give one more question, because I think we only have time for one more. Samir at the back. Oh, okay, two more. We have at the back there two gentlemen. Samir and then. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, many people. Okay. Circle back around.
Okay, three quick ones, and you can take whichever one you think is most relevant. One is, what's the policy? What are the policy barriers? Obviously, you know, you're working across a very wide range of countries in which governments are trying to, and regulators are trying to also pressure capital and the type of work you're trying to do. So where are the policy advances that can be made? Second thing is, Harlan, you talked about that, you know, the sort of street level loans. I thought that was a very, very important point. The majority of global media businesses globally are small. And as you say, they can't access debt, loans, et cetera, et cetera. So is there any work going on in what you're doing, looking at new product categories to sort of, you know, this sort of media-specific lending stuff or whatever it might be? And then at the other end of the scale, you've got IFIs, you know, huge amounts of money in many of these markets. What's happening to engage and motivate those kinds of lenders to participate in this kind of sector?
Yeah. So let's take those two questions, and we might be out of time. But please go ahead.
Sure. Oh yes, happily answer the Stone Age question. So you're completely right. These tend to be very conservative businesses, but I think there's two sort of misunderstood layers to this. One is that in the U.S., as in other places, broadband access in small communities is terrible. So in a lot of these places, the print product has hung on because there really is no alternate way of accessing media. So in many of our markets, we don't actually shut down the print product because that is the way people get their news. The other thing I would say is the conservatism doesn't necessarily come from mindset. It comes from these being small family businesses who can't get bank loans to do interesting things. So it really is a lack of investment capital and a lack of expertise to be able to say, even if I did have that bank loan, how would I invest? I mean, these folks have been heads down in the trenches for very long. So, you know, we perpetually say we see the glass is half full, not half empty. And in many of these places, when we do invest in their products, they love it. They're like, finally, we get new websites. Finally, we get newsletters. So I think it's important to kind of disaggregate the conservative reputation from the lack of access to capital and also the lack of access to broadband.
And then finally, I don't know if either Harlan or Jakub, you have final remarks based on policy levers, the role of the big lenders, IFIs, DFIs, or anything else. Go ahead.
I can do DFIs if you do policy. How's that? So, you know, we've spent many years trying to bring the DFIs into this space. So, for those who don't know, DFIs are development finance institutions like International Finance Corporation, and pretty much every Western country has a development bank, for example. And there are also regional DFIs. So we've attracted one into one of our funds. So the Danish IFU, it's the Danish Development Bank. But it's been very hard to attract others. And part of that is because they have very, very, very high profit expectations, surprisingly so. But the stated profits that they're seeking are, very commercial rate, let's say. Second of all, we have to face the fact that independent media, at least in places where we work, are potentially controversial. And development finance institutions do not want controversy. They're very much tied to a world of intergovernment relations. And so you have media companies that are challenging governments. You can imagine that they're not necessarily the most attractive candidates for their financing. So all of that together has made it hard. And even their impact metrics are challenging, because generally their impact metrics are job creation, right? And media companies are not the best producers of jobs, in terms of just pure numbers of people who get employed by them. So those are the challenges, but we continue to try to get them on board.
And then last comment. Oh, no, they're saying I need a last comment. Samira will talk to you about policy levers another time. But thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and to our amazing speakers.